Call to order for a Watertown City Council work session meeting for September 11th of 2023. I will call the roll, and I'm just going to go down the table. So Councilman Peters.
Here.
Councilman Danforth.
I am here.
Councilman Tupper.
Here.
Councilman Jurens.
Here.
Councilman Schutte.
Here.
Councilman Bueller is absent today. Chair will take a motion to approve today's agenda.
Second.
Motion made by Councilman Tupper, seconded by Councilman Schutte. Any discussion on that? Hearing none, the motion is to approve the agenda. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries. I don't see this on the agenda, but I don't really care, so we're going to rise. And Councilman Schutte, lead us in a really quick prayer. Please mention September 11th anniversary.
What's the 23 years?
22 years.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, this beautiful day that we have to live, to breathe, to move about our lives, the freedom we have in this country to move about our lives, to freely worship, to freely not worship, to raise a family, to not raise a family, Lord. Today, Lord, we acknowledge our freedom through the travesty of 9/11. So at this very moment, I pray we pause for a moment to remember all the lost souls from 9/11. So just for a moment here, we just remain silent. And Lord, I just pray a hedge of protection around firefighters, police officers, all first responders that are living their lives so we can have freedom and safety and health and wholeness in our lives. So we just pray a hedge of protection around all of them as well. And now, as we even govern here, Lord, the freedom we have to govern in this culture, this country you've put us in to be able to govern this way, Lord, I give us the wisdom now today as we talk through ordinances and just work through this process of creating a safer, healthier environment for our community. In your name we pray. Amen.
Now would have been the time for roll call, but we're so expeditious that we've got that done. So we'll move on to the regular agenda, which is just one item on it, which is a recodification discussion. Is it recodification, recodification, recodification? Okay, recodification. We will adhere to that pronouncement or interpretation of how to say it. And City Attorney Carrico is going to be taking the lead on this, unless City Manager Mack, you want to preface it?
Sure. I can just share a little bit, as I mentioned on Tuesday night. So communities have an opportunity once every so many years to go through a recodification process, meaning you look at your ordinances in their entirety and make amendments to them all at once. So it's quite an undertaking. We take time to go through every title, every chapter. We're working with an outside provider, MuniCode. When it's all finished, they will house our codes on the website for us. It'll be a little easier to search, find information. We have gotten the comments back from MuniCode, so they really look at all of our ordinances from a legal perspective. So this is out of compliance with federal statutes, state statutes. Staff has had an opportunity to look through these titles as well and provide input based on current operations, things that they see out in the field. And now it's time for you all to deliberate and have conversations around, I think, Title 3, Chapter 3 is what we're talking about today, which is largely related to animals. We'll be bringing these titles and chapters to you over the next several months. The goal is to have this wrapped up by the end of the year or early next year. And then when you do the amendment, it'll be 2 readings like we do for all of our ordinances, but it'll be comprehensive. And with that, I will turn it over to Attorney Carrico. She and Mallory, our assistant, are taking the lead on this project, coordinating all of the moving parts, and She is the expert. Take it away, Lisa.
All right, just a quick question for the council. We do have printed copies. Roger, we can get you one at the end of the meeting if you want one, or anybody else for that matter. Council, do you want us to zoom in on this a little bit more if you want to look up at the screen?
Oh, sorry, wrong thing. All right.
Donuts. Or tacos. I prefer tacos.
Okay.
It should just be. Yeah, bottom right. Someone who knows computers, come on.
Oh.
There we go. I think that's great. Yep. All right, Attorney Carrico, I apologize for that.
And actually, before we get started with what's on the screen, just some administrative stuff because as they do the recodification, the provisions themselves will be renumbered. The numbers will be similar to what we have in our ordinances. However, one of the formatting questions that they had, and I've handed out a little sheet there for all of you, is what they call the degendering of the city ordinances. So in other words, rather than predominantly using he or she, and when I say that, either everything says he or everything says she, or one ordinance refers to he and then another section refers to she, they're going to what they call degender. As you can see, they will lean toward putting he or she in every line where that reference is made, or him or her. However, they will, when there's a title, try to defer just to the title. So if it's the director, later on in the sentence, if it's, you would normally say the director and then he shall, it would just say the director shall. Again. And then they use the plural when grammatically you might not use it. They gave an example. The mayor shall give their approval rather than it be the mayor, he or she. And then the last thing is when it comes to referring to them as he or she, using that phrase, that entire phrase, they indicated they can use the word or they can use a slash. They preferred the or, and I would tend to agree with them. It just reads nicer. It's more understandable. And that being said, obviously it's not an official action, but that's where I'm headed. If you guys have any concerns about that, we can talk about it or send me an email or the city manager. But I would probably tell them to proceed to do that just to clean it all up and so that it's uniform throughout the ordinance.
Just questioning, City Attorney Carrico had brought this to my attention just about 2 hours ago, and I said it would be my desire to have it be gender neutral, but it would be up to the council. Anyone have an objection to that? This way, at least you
Yeah.
have some guidance. I think most of us would be in agreement to that. Councilman Danforth?
Ms. Carrico, I got a question, and maybe this is for City Manager Mack. You described the role of whoever it is that's doing this review for us. Some of what we do is not associated to law or whatever, it's just what we have chosen in our city to do, not do, whatever. Do they look at those things and make comments, recommendations, or is it purely things like this? Is it purely as it relates to laws that we must abide by? Those things where we do have our option and our definition of what we want, don't want, are those things looked at? Are those things recommended?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Mayor.
We'll go through City Manager Mack first.
Thank you, Mayor. So yes, so they have looked at our ordinances in entirety. As it relates to specific languages, they've given comments on, as it relates to state statute, federal regulations, things like that. They have given us suggestions for example, franchise there's a title on franchises, and ours, was written in like 1993. It's expired. So they have suggested that we take that out entirely. They've provided comments on, you should take all of your fines and fees and refer to one fee schedule. But in terms of how we actually operate, no, they've not given direction on that. That really is up to this body.
Back to you, City Manager Mack, unless you had something to add to that. Oh, sorry. City Attorney Carrico, sorry.
Thank you, Mayor. So to me, this is a work session, it's discussion. If there's something that you don't see, that you have a question on or would like to see included, we can work on that and bring that back to you. And just so you know, yes, this has been reviewed, and staff was really great. And I just want to reiterate again, because I was surprised at how much feedback I got from staff on all the different titles as they were getting them. Some of them obviously will need a little more discussion, so that we can meet with all the appropriate department heads and staff, even though maybe one staff member had kind of taken the lead and said, hey, here's what I think should get changed. And now we kind of need to get together as a group of staff and figure out, is this the best version that we can give to council for review and comment. I also have here our lovely law enforcement officers who will help us with any questions you might have about the day-to-day operations of the animal control officer. Because they were the ones too that have reviewed this and had provided comment and some revisions of their own. So this document here was basically what Muni Code had suggested, some suggestions they made, as well as law enforcement and the Animal Control Board. So I've kind of put them all together. And we will go through them and see where we go. All right, so the first one, because we do get a lot of abandoned animals. And so we need to kind of put a provision in there so that when animal control is enforcing this ordinance, we can cover the abandonment of animals. So in the definition section, we did add the word abandon and what that means. Obviously, that's different than I've left a pet in my car, which I plan to come back to, and maybe someone's on vacation versus no, they have no intent of returning or claiming any interest in this animal. Moving on here. Okay, so we have, and I'm not as versed, so law enforcement's welcome to jump in as I muddy through this. So there's a dangerous animal declaration and there's a vicious animal declaration, okay? So we have two different definitions. Originally, this section, and I apologize because it's kind of going over 2 pages here, so let me scroll down here because there's the brunt of it. So this is for the dangerous animal. And in the original ordinance, all of these provisions were almost like a list. And when I revised it, I tried to give it a little more structure to kind of talk about which provision went to which part of the definition. And then law enforcement came in and said, hey, you're still missing something. So I revised it this morning. So if you were looking at your one over the weekend, it will be slightly different, okay? So a dangerous animal is a canine or crossbreed, obviously. And there's 2 types where they are basically inflicting injury on another animal or a companion animal. And then obviously when they're inflicting injury on a person. And then it's drafted so that there's an exception, like you're not dangerous if, it's not a dangerous dog if it's under certain circumstances. And so what I did is I split up the definition. Here's what it is for injury on an animal. Here's what it is for injury on a person. And then here's the exceptions where we're not going to hold this dog as a dangerous dog under these circumstances. And one, obviously, for the first one, for the companion animal, it's more about, the attack occurred, basically was the dog trying to defend itself? Was it trying to, there's no real physical injury to the other dog or cat, those type of things, because you do get, as you know, you do get neighbor to neighbor complaints. And these officers have to go and kind of differentiate as to what rises to that level. And then the next one is against a person, but we're not going to hold this canine dangerous, basically, if it's like a single nip or bite, because obviously dogs by nature, they get playful. Maybe they, do a little nip around the ankle versus is it something more? So we're trying to basically educate the public that every time, if your kid gets nipped by a dog, this isn't going to be, we're not going to issue tickets and say that this is have this dog declared dangerous. Okay. So that's in the definition. We added quail to domestic fowl. We added a nuisance, which basically, actually, I would ask, what precipitated this?
I believe that had to do with the, like kennels and things of that nature, if someone's not maintaining the kennels. It was just elaborating what nuisance actually means versus just a generalized one word in there, what does it actually mean? So if we go to enforce a unsanitary kennel.
Actually, we'd like to have you come forward and testify into the microphone, Captain. Captain Rehorst?
Thank you. There we go. All right. So the reason for putting the nuisance definition there is there's some parts of the ordinance that say nuisance, and for us to be able to enforce that ordinance, we wanted to actually have a definition of what that means. So it may differ from one person to another, but if we actually have a concrete definition in there on what this means, then it's easier for us to enforce those violations that come to us through a complaint or through our observations.
Okay. Next, and this was more the city attorney, is I kind of simplified the definition of pet shelter, only because it started to get into more of the administrative aspects of operating a pet shelter, as far as we're going to go into an agreement, we're going to do this. That's more behind the scenes. All we need the city council to declare in an ordinance is that we are going to have a facility for the impounding of dogs and cats. Okay. Then we go down to vicious. And one of the things that we had received back from the reviewers, MuniCode, is they wanted the definition of vicious dog to replicate state statute. So again, we put that in there. We did get some comment from law enforcement, which was about, I want to make sure it's in here. Let's see here. And no, it's not. So let's see. Yes, it is. Okay. So we had, we replicated the definition of vicious dog, but then the question came to legal, well, what if it's, by virtue of this definition, and mostly down here in section 2, subsection 2 here, is what if it's a Boy Scout selling popcorn? They're not invited onto the property. They're not one of these service organizations or, service people, as far as like a meter reader, that sort of thing. And what if this, something happens to that Boy Scout? And so I included down here licensees. That comes from property law, like personal injury law, where licensees are basically like the person who comes next door to ask for the cup of sugar. So I did include that in the definition so that we were basically covering those types of situations. Again, we could just kind of cleaned it up here in the no dog shall be found to be vicious and kind of made it more subpoints. Okay. But in other words, the substance of those two definitions basically did not change. Now, here you're seeing a huge strikeout. This was another suggestion by the reviewers, that the dangerous and vicious dog declarations is a process.
City Attorney Carrico, could you specify, we're trying to find you like a laser pointer, but in lieu of that, like I even have this up, but are you on section A there where you're striking?
Yep, this whole thing, sorry. Let's do it.
Councilman Peters?
Just a quick question, just to, and forgive my ignorance here, but on average, how many calls do you get or instances on a monthly basis for vicious or dangerous dogs? Just as we're going through this, it's just helpful to know how many.
So typically what happens is if anyone is you're actually issued a citation if you have a dangerous dog, and then you have a chance to appeal that if you want. And I would say we maybe have probably about 6 hearings a year in front of the Animal Control Board where someone's appealing a dangerous dog declaration. If an animal is declared vicious, on the other hand, then that animal is humanely euthanized if it's declared vicious. So as far as dangerous declarations, probably approximately six a year or so.
Here, okay.
Do you want to explain the conditions and then how that kind of escalates?
And I would even say, before you state something, while not high in number, the importance of it to the people affected makes it worthwhile for this discussion, because if you are one bitten, then it becomes very important. And also, if you're the owner of said animal, it's also very personal, so.
Correct, and as far as the process itself, if you want me to explain that, what typically happens if there's a dog bite, the officer will go there on scene to determine whether or not it rises to a vicious dog declaration, which then would mean, like I said, that it'd be humanely euthanized. If it doesn't rise to that level, then it's declared dangerous through a citation, and then the person that receives that has the opportunity within 10 days to request an appeal to that to the Animal Control Board, at which point then they would appear before the Animal Control Board and they would have a hearing in front of them, and then the Animal Control Board at that point would determine whether or not that dangerous dog declaration is upheld. If that dangerous dog declaration is upheld, then at that point they have another option to appeal that to the circuit court. And then at that point, I go before the circuit court to determine whether or not that dangerous dog declaration is upheld. If that declaration is upheld, then what happens, there's a series of requirements that fall within the responsibility of that dog owner to ensure are taking place, such as making sure it's on a leash, it's muzzled, it's confined, and things of that nature, insurance, additional insurance that has to be required. So, and then that is for the life of the dog unless the Animal Control Board determines a different time frame for that.
And we did have one, right, at least this year, that we did euthanize.
Yes, there's one that was euthanized this year.
Councilman Danforth has a question.
I do, and this is based on a personal experience that I've had. What we're referring to right now, at least my understanding, would be those that would be reported through our process as a city that we would be. But I had a dog once that had gotten hit by a vehicle, it was my dog. And then after that, I always say it tried to eat me because that's kind of what happened. But, so I ended up in the hospital as well as he did. The hospital then had to report the bite. And at that point, everything just kind of spiraled out of control. As far as trying to, me worried about myself, me worried about getting my dog fixed because it was significant, and then having to go through this whole process. How does that work when it's reported to us from a secondary? Do these things still pertain, or how does that process work?
Yeah.
Does it work differently?
It does.
So what happens if it's received from a medical facility? All the medical facilities in Watertown here have those dog bite report forms. Once they have one of those, what they'll do is they'll contact the police department to go take a dog bite report. And then what we'll do is we'll go up there, whether it's animal control officer during his hours or a patrol officer if it's outside of those hours, and they'll take that report. And then just follow up through that investigation to determine whether or not the dog is dangerous or not, or vicious or not. And then we're actually really fortunate, I believe, to have an Animal Control Board, because rather than have one singular person determine, is a dog dangerous or vicious, we have a board that it can go to for an appeal. So you have a body of people from the community that can make that decision.
So really what we've got is the reporting agencies or places, when they make their report, it falls into this system then, correct? Am I slightly differ, but it does fall into this for review and determination then, correct?
Correct, and that'll be the animal control officer will take a look at that report and determine, does this animal need to be declared dangerous or vicious, or neither of them?
Okay, good, because at the time that mine happened, the animal control board, I don't think was even in place, and it was just a rat race. So, thank you very much.
And just to elaborate on that, I mean, I've reviewed these reports as they've escalated, and, there are situations where, like, a dog will bite a child, and then it will actually say in the report of the animal control that, the dog already had an injury, the child was young, but stepped on the dog or basically bumped into the dog's injury, and so it was a, gut reaction from the dog. And so all those things go into account before the board, so. Okay, so this section looks entirely struck out because we're going to move it down to 3.06. So we'll get to that in a minute. All of this is, as we're going through these next pages that are all struck out, is just that we are moving it. So now we're on 3.0105. And this was struck out because, by me, in my opinion, a cat is an animal, so I excluded it.
There's the word nuisance.
Yep, right,
Right down.
yeah, and then there's our nuisance that we need to define. So one more reason for our definition. Okay, moving on. Feel like I'm in a game show. Okay, so we're moving on. None of these provisions were changed. Again, if you're having some bedside reading, and you read it and you have a question, feel free, but this was all approved in the past, and I reviewed it, and it all made sense to me. So now we get on to the regulations on the keeping of certain animals. This one, I am kind of opening up discussion to you, council. As you know, there was, I believe, an annexation request. And we'll pick on our Public Works Director a little bit in a minute here. So part of the annexation was that these people had kept horses. They would now be within the city limits. I don't remember how the annexation was going to get rezoned, but the question came to me about this section. It does not refer to commercial. It does not refer to industrial. And the way that it reads right now is completely relative to the R districts. So, but it does, the paragraph in and of itself is fine with me. This is a subjective decision that was obviously made in the past about horses in the R1 through R4 district, and I'm good with that, except for we now need to make some sort of determination about commercial and industrial if you don't want to already change this with regard to the R districts. So I did shoot this over to our community development manager and our public works director, and they are also reviewing that. I don't know, do you have any comment at this time, Heath, or no?
Yeah, I think that if anything, some clarity here on, because it is silent on the commercial and industrial areas, it's pretty clear what the rules are in these residential zones as listed. But like Lisa alluded to, we're silent on the commercial and the industrial zones, which as the administrator of the zoning ordinance, or at least my staff called out as the administrator of the zoning ordinance, that would lead us to believe that they are permitted there within certain boundaries or uses or guidelines that we can otherwise discern from the other areas of the zoning ordinance. And I believe Lisa would agree with that interpretation as well. So I think to help the question of what about horses in commercial and industrial, we could add something to this language to clarify that. I can talk more on the specifics of the recent annexation and CL if we wish to later on in the discussion here.
I think you might as well right now, Director Bonnet.
Perfect. Staff's recommendation of that, we were asked about our opinion on the use or allowance of horses in that piece being proposed to be annexed in Zone CL on the west side of the lake. And under the CL district, if it is annexed and if it is zoned CL, we have a permitted use of recreational use. And both community development manager and myself, although it's not specifically listed, like you can't list all, there's an indefinite number of recreational uses, so horses are not listed under that. But one could infer that horse riding is a recreational activity and could fall under that permitted use of a recreational use in the CL district. So that was our response to that question of whether horses would be allowed in that annexed parcel of land.
All right, any discussion on the horses? Councilman Jurgens.
In some of her testimony, she did talk about a couple other options that she was exploring, which would be housing, and I think there was some sort of therapy, horse therapy. That sounds like it's getting outside of the recreational use. Was that, or have you talked about that? Have you discussed that?
No, not specifically, again, with any rezone request. While it's important to know some specifics, sometimes it's such speculation that we're really basing it all off what's listed here and how that's defined. So nobody's come to us and asked, hey, what about a horse use in this scenario for therapy purposes? So we haven't bothered considering that. And frankly, we'd look at the city attorney for some guidance there too on any specific questions like that, knowing that the day that's approved, that may not be what they do, it may be what they do. But we would want to give them clear direction on what is allowable, that's for certain.
The big one in today's world is horse boarding. There's a huge demand for it, and it's big money, and it seems like commercial, but I'm not a person to win any or start any arguments on words.
Right. So my initial thought, first, a couple of things. On the therapy horses, I would actually probably akin that more to recreational in the sense that really they're riding these horses recreationally as a means of therapy to the people who are, to the victims. Usually it's abuse kids and stuff like that that are going through some sort of emotional therapy, and they're learning to basically connect with the horse and then ride the horse. So I guess I would akin that more to recreational activity. As far as horse boarding, I would probably, obviously, we would look at some examples from other areas. I would also be looking at what do we do about current kennels just for normal animal boarding. And then I would also say that there would probably be some revisions on within the city, within our building regulations, and because we would need, if they were boarding horses, there would be a whole nother set of regulations as to how much land they would have to have, what the stalls would be like, that sort of thing, if that's what they were really trying to do. Now, within the city limits, when we think about it right now, it never really came up. But it's because we are growing and we're getting these annexations, and those annexations are usually ag land, right? Or, so they're coming in, and this is how they were already using the land. So that's why we're trying to find basically a good medium. I also know, again, I'm not recommending that we be like another city, right? But I actually lived in Arizona in a complex that was completely within the city of Gilbert, and we lived in a subdivision, and the perimeter houses, because it was one of those things where over time, right, came into the city of Gilbert, they were allowed to keep farm animals. So it was literally, we called it the zoo, and it was around the perimeter of that subdivision, and then all the internal houses within that subdivision could not because they didn't have enough land space and they were too close to another neighbor. But the ones on the outskirts were allowed to. And then there was a big wall, and then on the other side was just a whole nother subdivision. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm just saying that, there's ways to be creative in addressing these annexations. And I would say that we would probably allow it, we would just need to have these guidelines, because the guidelines themselves would limit where someone could do that. Just like the zoning that we've put in, I don't know that this is the best comparison, just like the zoning regulations that are already in place for our cannabis. I mean, because they can't be near a church, because they can't be near, a school, because they can't, it already limits where they could actually do one. So it's the same effect, I would say, in my opinion. So we will be looking at that, but yeah, as of right now, if it's an industrial commercial, that it's allowed. There's no limitation on that. Any other thoughts, though, council, as we get into fine tuning some parameters?
Councilman Tupper has a comment or question.
I guess thinking about it and just using a little common sense is, you talked about riding horses, that would be allowed, that's recreational. Therapy horses, which would be allowed, that's recreational. But before we can do either of those, we have to board horses. So a little common sense approach would tell us that we have to allow the boarding of horses to be able to allow the other two.
Councilman Danforth?
A couple things here. Right now, there would be no requirement for, let's say I owned the old Shopko building, commercial. Right now, because it's allowed in commercial, nothing would require me under current ordinance to come to the city to say, here's what I want to do. I just could do it, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes and no. I mean, they could come and request it, but I would have to look at the regulations about just animals in general to figure out if there was a limitation as to the shelters that they're building and the facilities that they have.
Okay, no.
But yes,
I'm
but
talking
yes.
about the allowance of the horses. I don't need to get permission for that. Because if what I've heard is they are allowed in anything other than the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 R zones. So they're allowed. Now, how they're allowed there, meaning how they are kept or whatever, that's a separate issue. But they are allowed in all of those areas, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Is that really what we want?
That's what I'm asking you.
I question it. I really do. Because the other thing we don't do, we don't put a limit on it. So I could have 100 horses in the Shopko building or outside in that big parking lot. If the city said, here's what we need to have for stalls. I do have a question in regards to, Lisa, you said something about other regulations that govern this, and then you said specifications for the boarding of horses and businesses. In other words, what would we have for requirements for that? Mm-hmm. Do we have requirements and standards for that?
Right now, I think it would fall under the vet services, is my gut reaction. I'd have to review all of not all of the ordinances, obviously, but to see what the parameters are.
Councilman Peters has a comment.
Yeah, just to maybe piggyback off of Mike's comments here, I think it's a state animal industry board that would have those standards. I'm not sure, I'm just saying. But my question is on the neat and orderly piece, and I would say I agree with Mike. I think that there needs to be some language in here that gives us at least the ability to deny it. Mm-hmm. Because what I'm understanding in A is we can grant a variance should we want to. Is that accurate? So let's use this annexation piece that's up for discussion. Say we had the policy in place that said you need to come to us. It's not allowed in commercial, but we can issue you a variance. And so if the council thought it was appropriate, we could issue them a variance for that one piece to have horses, correct?
Right, if it was in these right now. Yep.
Yeah, so I guess it makes sense to me to add language for commercial and industrial and then let the council make the decision on a case-by-case basis.
And, sorry. So,
I'm sorry.
no.
Good. I'm good.
City Manager Mack had something to add as well.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll have Public Works Director ask his question first.
Okay, Director Von Eye?
Just as a point of clarity, yes, I agree. I think we need some guardrails on horses because otherwise it is wide open. If those do come in the form of a variance, I would recommend it actually be a conditional use, and then we would add those conditional uses to the applicable zoning districts that the council deemed appropriate. But that conditional use would then go to the Board of Adjustment, not to the council for final approval. It'd be a one and done approval at the BOA under a conditional use in any of the zoning districts.
And I'll go back to you, Councilman Danforth, but yeah, I was just doing a quick search. Seems like we've got a lot covered in Section 21 of our city ordinances on kennels. So just add, and specifically says conditional uses in one of them in 21. And more, it's basically commercial kennels are covered under conditional uses in Chapter 21 of our code. So, Councilman Danforth?
The other issue that in looking at the R zones, I could go up anywhere in town, and I could, as long as I had enough land area, which had to be a minimum of an acre, and I had to have 300 feet of road frontage, and I could request a rezoning to RG, which would then be the residential garage zoning.
Oh,
Okay? This states that horses would be allowed in an RG because RG is not specified as one of the listed. So right in the middle of town in a residential area, which the garage is, the RG is intended for residential. Right now, we're saying would allow horses.
yeah.
And that's another thing that I think needs to be added to the residential zoning. They shouldn't be. Now, I will say, I'm going to put a little caveat to that. Where we have locations like the current request, that's on the edge of town, and I know that we have some RG properties around the lake. That's where that whole zone initiated from, was from around the lake, okay? I know there are some individuals that have horses out in that area. My intent in doing this is not to say that they shouldn't have those. We need to find a way, when we are adjacent to agricultural land, I think we got to find a way to be supportive of some of those things. But knowing that we got to protect those areas that aren't adjacent to the ag land areas. I go back to, and I don't know the basis of this, we recently bought 4-point-some acres from, well, we bought it through the Bergs, but it was the Drake land.
Yep.
Out. And apparently, there was some stipulation when this whole restriction of horses occurred in Watertown. It put a restriction on them that I believe they were able to continue with the horses they had, but not replace any horses, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was probably, my guess is it was a grandfathered in situation.
And my question is why would we have done that? Because that wasn't residential. Why would that have been placed on them?
At some point, well, again, I can't speculate when that was approved. My guess is that, I hate to use the word guess, but I'm guessing. When that was, you're saying that when they bought that land, or what? When did that happen? Is what I'm
I
getting
don't
at.
know exactly, but they were explaining that to me
Right.
prior to.
So historically, when either the entire area got rezoned or zoned at some point, or their land got annexed in at some point, that condition was made, and that was so that then there wouldn't be a further growth of that type of situation. Because remember too, we're imposing this stuff on people after they have already, either they already have land, they already operate a certain way, it gets annexed to the city, or it gets rezoned. Well, then the people, how they are currently running the land, are usually grandfathered in. However, conditions are started to be placed on them so that eventually it would come into conformance with the rest of the town and how it's zoned. So just like when we have, when Brandy comes forward with different things, variances or rezone requests, and she'll say, this would then bring the person into conformance, or this would then bring the land in conformance. It's the same concept. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I could speculate too, I think part of it is the subjectivity of the current language. Like we've acknowledged, I think it needs some guardrails because there's a lot of subjectivity to it. So the staff, the city attorney, the planning administrator, the zoning administrator, 5, 10, 15 years ago, whenever that was, could have administered this completely different than we are today because of the subjectivity to the language that exists today.
oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I may too, this provision is written as a limitation. So in other words, council has the wherewithal to grant or deny the request of this variance. However, at least these minimum things need to have happened. Does that make sense? So this paragraph here is written so that it forces the adjoining landowners and the ones within the 300 feet to weigh in. And if they haven't, then that goes into the whole granting or non-granting of the request. So the reason I'm explaining that way is because as we get into horses, we could, you can, and also kind of piggybacking on our Public Works Director. So let's say you allow horses. We're going to put in some caveats. We're going to put in some stuff for the commercial and industrial, what can happen and how. So now they're coming in to make that request, and you guys you had each kind of commented on some things. So that would go in the revision, but it would still go to the Board of Adjustment, because I agreed when I read this, I thought it was odd that the city council was the one granting the variance. But if it went to the Board of Adjustment, you guys are already by ordinance telling the Board of Adjustment, here's the factors that you need to consider when it comes to horses, and here's the minimum requirements that need to happen, so that way they have enough guidance of what the city council and the citizens, after we approve this, had in mind when granting the variance for the keeping of horses in certain areas. Yep, I think and we did not talk beforehand. This is my own thing here, so I believe he's shaking his head up and down, so Public Works and I are on the same page. So that's my thinking. I would say if you have certain you're just, I don't know, thinking and whatever, shoot me an email, shoot the city manager an email or the Public Works Director on, here's my concern, or here's a scenario, just like Councilman Danforth, you mentioned before, here's the scenario, so that we can fully do our homework and put together something that would be amenable to the council and hopefully the citizens in Watertown with regard to the keeping of horses.
Councilman Tupper has something?
And I don't know who this goes to, probably Public Works Director Von. When you look at A, it says the city council should have the authority to grant variance above requirements after notice of hearing. Basically, you just covered that a little bit, but basically what that's stating is we're going to set the guidelines before it would go to Board of Adjustments, basically. Because here it's saying we have the authority to grant.
Yes, a plain reading of this, when I read it, I was under the impression that somehow these individual variance requests were coming to council. That's why I thought it was a little odd, the way that it was written. And again, I would like to make that clear that you guys are just setting the rules and Board of Adjustments making the decision.
Mayor May. Is that the way you understand it also, Mr. Bonai?
Yes,
That we
it
would
is.
set the guidelines and then it would go to the Board of Adjustments?
Yeah, if the framework is set up in this chapter of ordinance, this chapter, the Planning Commission, Board of Adjustment, they do not regulate Chapter 3. They do regulate Chapter 21. But because this is a land use issue, that's where Lisa and I are saying this sure makes and feels like it makes a lot more sense going to Chapter 21, a land use issue that the Board of Adjustment takes up as likely as a conditional use in the appropriate zoning districts. So you, as a council, would set the framework. What are those appropriate zoning districts to list horse use as a conditional use? And then further, what are the parameters for that horse use in those zoning districts? size of land that they need, number of horses they can keep, those kind of things that can all be identified and spelled out clearly in chapter 21, but then that leaves it out of the council's hands and into the Board of Adjustment to make those final determinations.
So this statement should be rewritten just a little bit to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Correct.
All right,
Okay, all
continue.
right. And I'm not trying to go down the rabbit hole here, but subsection B caused me a little bit of concern. I am actually not a horse person, but if I remember correctly, sometimes smaller hooved animals are kept with the horses to keep them peaceful, such as goats and whatnot. So we'll be tweaking that as well, just either to make it clear that, nope, I'm sorry, number 2, that there's no hooved animals other than horses kept within the city limits. My guess is we'll still keep it that way, but I just wanted to put that out there that you might get comments from other people who keep horses that does happen. So I just want to highlight that. Number 3, domestic fowl, that was actually more grammatical. And also we have the permissions coming from the animal control officer rather than the animal control board.
City Manager Mack?
I have a question about that process. So does the animal control officer decide what process is used to allow fowl? So currently, if you want to have chickens in your backyard, your neighbors have to agree to it. And then the animal control officer comes out, checks your space, looks at your form, and signs off on it. And I'm not suggesting that we dictate operations in the ordinance, but who's responsible for deciding what process we use?
Right,
I heard
so-
a whisper.
Right, so typically what happens is, like you said, they will get a hold of the animal control officer, and there's a form, they have the neighbors look at that, so they're aware of what's going on, neighbors sign off on it, and how that process goes about is the chief of police takes care of that, but that's what we have been doing, and then our animal control officer also follows up on those fowl permits that are issued to determine whether or not those property owners still do in fact have, chickens or whatever they may have, their quail, and make sure that they still have that, or they have the need for the permit.
So that would mean we would probably revise to put at least upon application to the animal control officer. So at least the citizen who's reading this knows where they need to go. Would that be, yeah?
I'm not sure that that's entirely necessary. I was just, because what we hear is, well, I can't have chickens because my neighbors don't want them. And so why do they get to decide what I get to have on my property? And so it used to be the animal control board decided that, right?
Correct, and then when we began reviewing these, we found that the animal control officer is one that's actually been approving them for the last number of
Yeah.
years, so.
Okay.
Councilman,
That might just be an operational thing to talk through. I don't know.
Councilman Danforth?
On any of these animals that are prohibited, okay? Can a variance request be applied for, or does prohibited means no way? No, you can't even ask for it. So if I had a place and I wanted, I don't know, let's say it's I can't have a hooved animal. I got a horse, which I can have, but I can't have a goat.
Correct.
Okay? So can I ask for a variance because they're prohibited?
Right.
Goats are. Can I
Not at
ask
this
for-
time.
Is that so there's no varying that. When it says prohibited, it means don't even ask, correct?
Correct, because as Public Works Director mentioned, really the variances are under Title 21, and we don't have anything in Title 3 allowing the law enforcement or the animal control officer to make the subjective decisions.
Okay, so to follow up on that, I got to, and I'm just thinking out loud here. So you're right in the middle of town, you got a residential property, and I want a horse. Well, not the right place for a horse. But I'm on the edge of town, let's say I'm right next to the Rusinks, or whatever their last name is, and it's residential, adjacent to the ag land that's around me, do we have any ability at that point to say, look, in that location, it's probably okay? But we don't, do we?
For the horse or the hooved animal? Hooved animal, no. Horse, potentially.
Horse we don't even, right? Not in a residential, if it's zoned residential.
Well, they can under this as long as the petition has been met.
Under commercial, but residential, I can't. So let's say I bought the land right next to, is it Rusinks? Is that the last name? Okay, because I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. All right, so I buy the land next to them and I get it zoned R1 and I build a house. They have horses because it's commercial, recreational. I want a horse. Can I have a horse if I go through the process?
Yes.
Reason why-
Yes, if you get 100% of the adjoining landowners and 50% of the landowners within 300 feet, and you have a fence and wood or equivalent fence at least 2.5 feet high.
Unless you want to redefine what stipulates that approval.
Yeah.
That's what this is all about, really.
So then I could in town then too, anywhere in town.
Yeah.
Okay,
As long as
not-
you get all that approval in any of those districts above, R1 through R4.
Okay.
Councilman Peters?
So not to beat a dead horse here, no pun intended. But, okay, I think we all get the zoning ordinance. So I would propose adding in commercial and industrial language.
Okay.
Is there any thoughts on that, fellow council members? That, to me, I think that's where we're headed, is we're heading to somewhere where we can essentially legislate through policy what people can and can't have. So I would move to put commercial and industrial in there.
And, oh, sorry. Mayor.
Councilman Danforth?
And I agree with, if I interpreted what Heath had to say, I think they should be conditional uses in any and every application because, again, we had ordinances that I know, I was on the plan commission years ago when this long discussion about all of these things occurred, and horses was a big topic at the time. I was really surprised when I got to looking into this, that horses were still allowed in the city limits, based on all the conversations that took place 12, 14, 15 years ago over the same topic. So, I know there's places that it would fit and be well suited within the community. There's a lot of places that wouldn't. I like the idea. I think we do need to do as Kyle suggested, but I also think we need to probably have some type of limit so that, Mike doesn't go out and buy 100 horses. And I like the idea of it being a conditional use, personally. Heath, is that what you were suggesting? Is that possibly get added in that manner? I agree with that.
And I knew we would be on this one for a little while, so I hate to keep elaborating on this, but actually, if you take a strict reading of this provision too, if the animal, kind of going to Councilman Juren's previous comment, if you go to a horse as a service animal or an assistance animal, they actually don't need the 100%. They don't need the adjoining landowner's approval. So, lots to do on horses. Any other comments though on horses as we start to try and refine that? Again, as we send it off, please let us know if you do have any concerns or comments as we get through that process. Because my guess is at least Title III will come back to a reading probably in the near future where we will then be saying, okay, and we're going to push this or at least cross-reference it over into zoning and variances and conditional uses. Okay. All right, so we got through that one. Again, all good as we're going. Okay. This one came how?
That specific one in there, we had looked at and we could not determine the last time those reports had actually been given to the animal control officer. So therefore, we decided that's something we haven't been doing for probably quite some time, or have not been receiving those reports from the veterinarians in town. So if we do need to obtain vaccination records, the veterinarians in town here are always very forthcoming to get us that information for any sort of dog bite or anything like that. So it was something that was in there that's not being done anymore. So we suggest that it be removed.
City Manager Mack? Oh, okay.
Okay, moving on. Let's see here. Fees, we just tightened this up to kind of be similar. If you remember when we did the alcohol license for the special events, and we said instead of changing the ordinance every time we change the fee, we would just refer to a fee schedule established by resolution of the city council. So we struck all of that out. This one, I believe, was myself, and it was just really to tighten it up. I believe it was me. I don't think it was you guys. He's speed reading. Okay.
I believe that might have also been another one, looking at it now, where it's a process that we're no longer doing and have not been doing for some time. So again, to clean up the verbiage in these ordinances, making more applicable to what the processes are currently.
Okay. 3.0313, that's where we're jumping down now to now. That was all grammatical. So let's keep on going. Okay, so then we get down to 3.06. This is where we repasted the dangerous and vicious dogs process. The recommendation from MuniCode was that this be its own chapter because of the process, and to basically create more overarching paragraphs, and basically just the organization and the outline format of this particular section. The substantive changes were none. I basically kept it and just basically reformatted it and kind of cleaned up the grammatical. Oh, yes, thank you. I did. See, almost forgot. So let's go down. So once a dog has been declared dangerous, the animal control board or the animal control officer can issue conditions on the pet owner as to continue to keep their dog. You just need to do certain things. And one of the things that they added was microchipping, which is highlighted on your hard copy. And I will take that over back to Captain Rehorst.
This was something that was brought up as we discussed this with the Animal Control Board, and the reasoning behind this is we have instances where an animal is declared dangerous, and that dangerous declaration is upheld by the Animal Control Board. Once we go to follow up, we follow up with all dangerous dogs within the city every year, and if someone says, I moved that dog out to the county, the dog you're looking at is a different dog. This allows us to ensure that the dangerous dog that we declared dangerous is no longer in the community, and that's the dog we're looking at. Because as you know, sometimes dogs all look the same, so this allows us the ability to differentiate between which dogs are which. And if you notice in there, we also put not until that final determination, whether that's the Animal Control Board or the circuit court that makes that final determination. So once that's done, then the microchipping is required.
Councilman Shetty?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I guess microchipping, what exactly, is there anyone can embellish on what that all has besides identifying a dog? Just so we know what we're forcing a homeowner to have their dog.
Right, it's a relatively inexpensive process that they can go to a veterinarian, they put a microchip in it, and then we have a reader that we can hold up to that and identifies a certain serial number, what have you, for that animal that will then be cross-referenced to that actual animal.
Just follow up.
Follow up?
So, I mean, what else, is there anything besides, what does microchipping as a whole, other information, details? You know, as a human, it'd be a privacy issue probably, but with an animal, I'm just wondering, is it just identifying a dog, or is there other information that that chip keeps track of? And
Correct. What it cross, if it goes to basically a serial number, then that serial number, we would have the information to based on the veterinarian that I put it in, who that belongs to. So it lets us identify the actual animal and make sure that's the one that was declared dangerous.
okay, and that's all microchipping does, just for identification. Doesn't
Correct.
have any other purposes for it or nothing else?
Correct. So some private, other dog owners, they'll get their dogs microchipped in the event it's lost so they can identify their dog. That's another,
Okay, all right, thank you.
you're welcome.
So the rest, again, was as far, and I guess just for your own knowledge, so if they're declared dangerous, well, some of the things that can be conditions is a leash, a muzzle, microchipping, confinement, insurance on the dog, notification of escape, and then we also have some stuff about failure to comply. We actually do use this because we have recently had at least 2 that have failed to comply on more than one occasion, and this allows me to present it to the judge in court when we're prosecuting those offenses. The microchipping would also help actually in that type of testimony if the owner was trying to say it was a different dog. Then we did add a section about the human, well, it was a type, I think that was a grammatical.
Yes, Yes, I think they're looking at euthanization versus euthanasia. It was just a typographical error.
The euthanasia of vicious dogs. And then obviously there's a change of ownership section, which I actually found I liked it. I thought it was a good idea that they had in there, is the change of ownership, because then just like the same thing, that dog's in the county or I gave it away, or whatever it is them having to be responsible to let us know. And then obviously the continuation. And then obviously police and military animals are exempt from this section. And once we've changed it, it operates moving forward, but would not be applicable to basically past, or if someone's in a current violation. And then the last 2 that are crossed out, that was due to, again, Muni Code's recommendation that our punishments, rather than have to change the ordinance every time and have it in every single title, was to put it in Title 22, which is our general provisions title. So we are working through that. Obviously, as you're thinking about it, though, there are other city ordinances that we have, other titles, where it's not just necessarily maybe a flat rate fine, or there's per day type violations. That's usually found in building services. So we may leave that in their current titles, but there will be a general reference in Title 22 to the different, basically it's every time the state allows us to fine more than, right now it's 500 and our ordinances say 200, it would be clarified in Title 22. And that is it on animal control, unless you have more comments.
I got one question. On the change of ownership,
Go there.
let's say that's me, and I don't tell you, I don't report it. What's our recourse? Is there like a penalty, $1 penalty? Is there a fine? Is there, in a scenario like that?
So right now, it would be, because again, the acronyms within the city tickets are different. We kind of group things under one. So it would probably be failure to comply with the dangerous dog declarations, because part of the declaration, part of the conditions would be about change of ownership.
And so we've already got somewhere in our fee schedule that we're going to have some kind of a catch-all.
Right now, I think the fee for violation of that, it would be, I think it's $126.50.
I think it should be 70 cents.
Any further discussion, council? City Manager Meck?
Yep.
On that last part, so it doesn't specifically call out that there's a penalty or fine for not complying with this? Is it
Correct.
inferred with so if you don't comply with all parts of this ordinance, then you can be fined?
Correct. But I would, because we are actually, that's why we're having this discussion, because you as also citizens, the way that you're interpreting it, it would behoove us to probably add a sentence of clarification on that.
Any further discussion, council? All right.
Sorry, Mary, I'm just taking some notes here. Okay, so next, or, I'm sorry, are we ready to proceed with the next?
Well, we're
right,
still,
thank-
actually, it's not even the next because it's still item A under 4.
Okay, so just to kind of give you guys a heads up, Trent, do you have that next one? And I just have the table of contents up on the, right, start right at the beginning, I guess. So I have not made a further revision to Title VII yet based on Muni codes because I wanted to kind of just walk you guys through some stuff and see if initially you had any comments or concerns with actually trying to follow some of their recommendations. Because again, as City Manager Mack mentioned, you know, some of this stuff is subjective and is our choice. You know, they're just here to kind of, you know, provide us with their own recommendations. You always have the option to not follow them. So, all right. One of the things that they talked about, and actually the community development manager and I had talked about this a little bit early on before we even got these requests, is 7.01 is the city limits and datum line. And if you go to 7, look at all that loveliness. This is the city limits of Watertown, basically described in almost like a meets and bounds description. It's very long. I can tell you right now, it's not updated based on when we have zoned stuff in. However, we obviously do need to reference what the city limits entail. The preliminary discussion right now with community development and the public works director was to refer to a map of the city that is kept with the city engineer. And then that would be updated every time we do a rezone or every time we annex something in. I mean, they already keep that stuff. It's just, if we want to do a legal, we need to go out, get a surveyor, and actually put this all in. And then every time there was an annexation, we'd have to do it again. And so that was also one of the recommendations of the Muni Code people. And so I just wanted to kind of show you what we're talking about. So the city limits part, it would literally have probably just a short paragraph basically saying, you know, is the city map kept with the city engineer's office and updated as, you know, per city council resolutions, or, you know, however, you know, I'll figure something fancy to say. But we're going to get rid of this unless you guys really feel attached to it.
I remember reading through our city ordinances one time and getting to that, and it's like, okay, this must make sense to someone.
Okay. Wards, I believe we're okay with, and I mean, I actually have, but I will say that I have not checked it to see if it was updated, but I'm pretty sure it was when you guys did the redistricting of the wards a couple years ago.
It was pretty recent.
Yeah,
within
so
the
I
last
think this
2
was
years.
done at that time, but I will be double checking it.
Councilman Tupper?
Aren't wards reset after a census?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, and I'm breezing through council
City
procedure.
Attorney Carrico,
Sorry.
couldn't the wards also be defined by the map?
We could, if I was a layperson though, and we do have a map online, don't we, with the wards? I believe we do. So yeah, we could have a map. You know, my other thought was leaving the wards as is because someone could read it and, you know, because it actually talks more about streets and where the wards begin and end. So, I mean, if, in other words, a layperson could read it and know where the ward is, but I'm also just as amenable to referring to the map again because they would already be color-coded, it's already on our website, it would already be available by the city engineer. What are your thoughts?
Personally, I'd be okay with that. Councilman
So
Tupper?
moved.
So is it only defined during a census, or is it allowed by law for us to reset those?
I am not, that would be something I'd have to research.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, this is all about work session. Okay. This one, let's see what they had to say. Get rid of it. Okay, so they said, which we will be probably striking at least one. The one franchise addressed in this chapter appears to have expired somewhere around 1993. Fabulous. It is stricken as obsolete, so they will be striking it. In addition, they recommend that all franchises be omitted from codification. If you want to have the franchises, they suggest that it be an appendix to the code. I'm not opposed to doing that. We can obviously present it to the council. So I don't know if, and obviously for the new members of council, this might not have come up yet. So Brookings, Aberdeen uses a different service, but there are other municipalities, and it doesn't have to be Brookings, I think Deadwood does one. There's a lot of municipalities within South Dakota that use MuniCode, and when you click on their when you actually search for City of Watertown, it'll come up, and then there'll be, a table of contents on the left-hand side, and at the top, it will say appendices, and then you click on that, or appendices, you click on that, and it'll have, that's where this would then end up. I'm good either way. I'm not, lying down on the train tracks for that one.
Councilman Tupper?
What's the purpose of franchisees? Is it basically like cable companies, stuff like that?
Which actually I noticed, and I'm wondering if they're wondering if this one here, this Midland Life, Cat TV, I'm wondering if that's the one that they think is outdated.
Well, yeah, that would be way outdated.
So that was the first one that I popped in my head. But yeah, basically, it's all cable television, and we will
Thank you.
bring something forward for you guys on that, since everybody's looking a little like, yeah.
There actually looks to be a couple references here that makes me wonder the last time anyone looked at this.
And we're doing it. Okay, so I'm gonna breeze through that one. Let's see if I'm gonna do this a little quicker.
Lisa, if I could.
Yes.
One comment I would have there, it'd be curious to research other communities' current standards on how they handle, really this is right-of-way management and the allowance of third-party utilities in the right-of-way, whether that's still through franchise agreements. I find it's questionable to me whether that's still how they do it today. They may still exist, but anyway, that's some research I can help look into as well. And as far as third-party utility management in our right-of-way.
I love it. And that brings up something. So, just so council gets where I'm coming from as the city attorney, if we don't need the ordinance, I generally have a less is more policy. I try to clean stuff up. A punch list is probably not the right word, but when I think of ordinances, it's just like, what are the priorities? What are the overarching, right, shell? And then all of the, what they talk about, right, the shell of the house, and then whether or not, we have beds and what kind of beds and what kind of lights and whatever, really that's your standard operating procedures, your personnel policies, your rules and regulations, those type of things. So that is kind of how I operate. So that's why I say when we look through this franchise section, we'll probably, cut that if it's already addressed somewhere else adequately, obviously. So for the Watertown Regional Library, one of the comments that they made was, at least as far as this defacing public property down here below, was more about to move it into public spaces in another section of our titles. So I will be taking a look at this as a whole, but this 7.05 might get basically gutted or removed or moved to another title, is what I'm going to get at there. This one, again, was more about the comments made were you have personnel policies and you don't need this. Or if you really feel passionate about it, you put it in an appendix. Thank you. Yeah. So that's probably going to happen unless you guys end up feeling strongly about it. And then for police department, it was their only recommendation was down here at the bottom. They have resisting officer, and they were fine with the offense, but that we needed to move it into offenses in the proper title. So there's a title where there's like offenses and things, and so that's where we would put it. So it's just basically moving it.
City Manager Mack?
Yep. I'm assuming that when we bring this back for additional conversation, we will have cleaned up language so that it reflects the new form of government and our charter, because there are things in here that are inconsistent with the charter.
Yes, and are you saying this title specifically, or are you talking about the ordinances as a whole? I mean, as a whole,
so this
definitely.
title specifically, but also this chapter specifically, but Title VII in general, there are several things that just don't jive with the charter.
Yes.
Okay.
And that I do not believe was completely picked up on with regard to the Muni Code. I mean, they did change some where they found them, right? And then they made a general reference to make sure that those documents coincide with each other. And then, let's see, just kind of breezing through. This one's still under review, making sure that with Public Works, making sure that we have the city engineers stuff correct. I'll also be looking at it just to see if it's really necessary or can be cleaned up, shortened up. But sorry, they made a comment about, sorry that I'm breezing through this, it's kind of, okay. Oh, appropriations, that's what it was. This should be eliminated, as well as the other finance-related provisions and grouped in a finance chapter, if you guys wish. Okay, moving on to, here's one. So basically what was discussed by the reviewer is that when this ordinance came about was basically when there weren't as many state and federal laws dealing with fair housing. And so cities enacted these ordinances. And now they have become obsolete because they're already covered under state and federal law. I don't know that it, and again, it's up, this is kind of more of a subjective, what are you guys thinking? I would be fine maybe paring it down just to say we, as a city, obviously want fair housing, and kind of clean up these provisions, but a lot of this stuff would be taken out. Any thoughts? Otherwise, their recommendation was actually just to get rid of it entirely.
City Attorney Carrico, I'll get with you on that. I've been working with our Fair Housing Board because there was a vacancy on their board that I was supposed to appoint someone to, and knowing, or City Manager Mack and I had been discussing the necessity and the redundancies possibly with state and federal law, but there actually might be some restrictions about what we can cut out and still have a Fair Housing Board and get federal money here in Watertown. Councilman Danforth?
When we talk about the fair housing portion up here, are we talking about affordability and, well, what's the word I want, where we are not being prejudiced or towards something, or does that also include the quality of the home, the living quarters?
It's a little of both because your quality, in other words, it's basically telling someone, mostly it's geared toward what I'm going to say like landlords when you come to quality, because they're basically trying to say, hey, if you have a unit and you're renting it to someone, you need to make sure that, you know, there's no mold, there's no, you know, you need to make sure that you have a quality home, at least the bare minimum of necessity and quality. Then there's also just in general for everyone, right? But when I say this, really that's going to be covered under building codes, right? Is just for anybody, if you build a home and try to sell it, it should have XYZ. And then, yes, there's then that added layer of just people who apply for either rentals or they want to buy a home. And see, when you go to buy a home and you're talking about fair housing, that is really where federal and state law come into play. Because that's really about not only the actions of the seller, but it can also be the actions of the lender. So then that's when those really come into play. Now, I have seen, but usually they're huge metropolitan areas. I would suggest, you know, for some, as a caveat as to what I'm about to say, we're not there, you know. But obviously, yes, if you're living in a major city like, you know, Chicago or Grand Rapids, Michigan, or, you know, Kalamazoo, Detroit. I probably shouldn't put Detroit as the best example, but they have, within the city itself, they actually have, you have to register your rental, you have to have it inspected, they give you a punch list, you have to correct all these items. Can you tell I'm speaking a little bit from experience? And then you're issued basically a license to basically just rent the home. Are we there yet? No, I don't think so. They also have, it can get very particular with fair housing because let's say you're advertising to, and again, this is within the city though. I don't want you to panic about state and federal, but within certain cities, they have basically said, if you advertise for student housing, like it's just a private house and you're advertising just to students, then there is a layer of age discrimination because you're basically saying that only young people can live here or young people can't live here. Obviously, there's a balance to that because there are true 55 plus communities, right? But it's all nuanced by a city, and usually, though, it's based on the population and the makeup of the population. Yes?
Okay, good.
I kind of digressed on that. I kind of went off on a little tangent there.
Well, the one thing that I've seen, we've probably all seen it, and I don't know how we control it internally, and maybe we don't. I don't know that. But in regards to the livability or the quality of a home, now I'm talking about as a renter, not as a buyer. You're going to buy or build. Okay, we got standards for that. But where do we in our ordinances, how do we and where do we have any authority or responsibility as it relates to quality of housing, the livability of a house?
Just for rentals, is that what you're asking?
It'd be a rental. It wouldn't be a for sale thing. They can do what they want with for sale. They can make that decision, be buyer beware. But for those that are renting, do we have anything in our ordinances that enables us to say that's not a livable residence? Now, granted, if it doesn't have a roof, we can go through and condemn or whatever we do, but
Sure.
do we have any kind of housing authority as it relates to quality?
To my knowledge, no. And I can tell you, though, that right now what's being used in the rental aspect is, one, the market and the tenant themselves. But if you're talking about but for low-income people who are on housing assistance, Housing Authority actually does inspect the unit, and they will give you a punch list of items. It'll be things like, electrical, GFCI outlets, things like that, if they see something. So before they will grant assistance for rent for that particular unit, they send one of their maintenance workers out there or inspectors, and they will inspect the premises, and then they give the landlord a punch list if there is something, and if there's not, then there's a go-ahead for the tenant to move in and start receiving assistance. So there is that, what I'm going to call probably for the more low income. And then for just regular commercial Joe Schmo, or I shouldn't say commercial, but, tenants who are not on housing assistance, it really is just the market and complaining to the landlord. And there can be safety issues that come up that could be egregious. And usually the city does get involved just in the sense of a courtesy. But yeah, you're right. There's no actual, hey, we are able to issue a ticket or cite someone.
What we don't have that other cities do is a formal rental inspection process. And typically it's a function carried out by like the code enforcement officer or somebody in community development, a building inspector, and they'd actually go perform rental inspections. It's a very time-consuming process that would, take the staff, the staff power to do so. But there are communities around us that do exercise a formal rental inspection program. We do not have one adopted, though.
Okay.
Councilman Tupper, did you have something?
Sorry.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback on Councilman Danforth, just recently a lot of, or I shouldn't say publicity, a lot of news stories coming out of Sioux Falls with some of these types of properties. So is that kind of what triggered a little bit of your questioning? Or?
Well, I've just seen it locally.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is some locally that I've also witnessed that.
And we do use, I feel like there's some state codes. And again, I'm not going to talk about the conditions of the house in the sense of a renter, but I do know that sometimes I've seen landlords come or mostly, or I should say neighbors too, that a unit next door to them has started to decay, and we do issue notices and talk about demo and we're going to charge it back. But it would be nice to have just a little bit more clarification for those people who, we do try, with cleaning up your yard. But we do get stuff where, under state statute, where we can condemn a property. But as far as just the regular, shell of a rental and there's some stuff inside, no, we don't have anything like that for enforcement. Anything else on that one? I'm getting some good
City Manager Mack.
conversation.
I would just comment, and it's not necessarily related to the ordinance revision, but that's a great topic that if the council wanted to dive in further at a future work session, we can gather information from other communities. As Public Works Director Von I indicated, it is incredibly time consuming, and I'm coming from smaller communities and know how time consuming it was. But that doesn't mean it's not something we shouldn't discuss and maybe shouldn't look at doing in the future. But that's a great topic if you all want us to do some research and have discussions with you about it.
So the next one, again, this was also something that the reviewers suggested be excluded from publication or put in an appendix, is this cable television regulatory ordinance. So that may come your way as either striking completely or minimizing and putting it into an appendix. I noticed that the franchise, and I'm going to step off onto a different title. One of the reasons I started with Title III was because it's going to take a little work on Title I. Title I was the airport. And one of the things that we did when we met, we did have a work group that met about the airport ordinance. And it was decided that almost, I would say 75% of that ordinance is actually just standard operating procedures and things that the FAA already requires. It was literally stuff like what had to be in a lease, I mean, it was probably good at the time. And especially when we did not have a city manager form of government, because you were basically telling the airport board how to do these things. But now we are more in an era of these are already in standard operating procedures for the airport, so we're going to get rid of it, and not entirely, but I mean we're going to pare it down a lot. So that one will probably be at the next work session. Will be the airport. Okay, so anyway, moving on to 7.15 was the mayor's committee for people with disabilities. Let's see. Dang. As you can see, we're still in franchise. All right, here we go. So according to our reviewers, they would like to see all committees should be grouped in a single chapter with articles and divisions. Yeah, I'm seeing some heads shaking up and down. And it would also, I think, keep it cleaner in the sense of sometimes we actually are like, do we have a board for that? Or I didn't realize there was a board for that. It would also just help and steer council discussion as to how many boards do we actually need? How many committees do we actually need? I believe that is part of the discussion for the council retreat. So we will be reserving that discussion for that time. But I just wanted to put that out there. And this would be one of them, probably, that would go into however we just decide to structure that. Okay. They said the same thing about the Upper Big Sioux River Watershed Advisory Board. Do we have a Big Sioux Watershed Advisory Board? Some of you are shaking no, some of you are shaking up and down. This one may go. And there's so there we go. There was also, again, it would go under the boards and committees, or it would be its own chapter, is the Charter Revision Committee. I do know that we want to keep that in place, obviously, but it may go into a different title. And there's the Business Improvement District. Whoops, sorry, I got ahead of myself here. They didn't have anything about elections. They left it alone. So, and they left that alone. And we talked about that one. So now we're on Watertown Business Improvement District. Any thoughts from anyone? Even Public Works, any thoughts on this one? I have no.
I'll make one quick comment if I could, Mayor. The Upper Big Sioux Advisory Board. So since our formal, we are no longer a formal recipient of the 319 grant program from the state for that Upper Big Sioux Watershed program, that the state combined our program with the Day County Watershed program. And so I think we still need to frankly iron out a little bit of detail on what kind of representation we have on that board, but we do not have our own Upper Big Sioux Watershed Advisory Board any longer because we are not the sponsor or the recipient of that grant program from the state anymore. So that thought I'd provide some context there.
Thank you. With regard to this one here, their suggestion was to move it into either its own title with other taxation type provisions that we have, or we make it its own, yes, we pair it with, remember how in one of the previous ones they talked about making like a finance section, we could put it in there. So basically it'll just get moved and probably tweaked a little. And then.
Councilman Danforth?
Yep.
Lisa, I don't know the name of it, but they're active in regards to Lake Compesca. Is that the Lake Compesca Watershed Board? Is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Where is that in this whole scheme of things?
I think it's in its own, I'd have to look in the thing, but I feel like it's in another section of the titles.
I don't think we, as a city, have anything to do with that board because it's, they voted to tax themselves. We don't appoint anyone to it. That's my understanding on it. Same with the
Correct.
Lake Pelican one.
Correct. They're their own governing body based on the mill levy that they are able to assess the residents adjacent to the lake.
That's correct under my understanding as well. And just doing a quick search through our ordinances, I don't see any.
It didn't come up?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, Mayor, if I may, but, and again, maybe I'm speaking completely out of turn, but if we don't have city representation on there like we do have liaisons, we should have. I mean, I look at all the discussions that take place at and around our lake and everything that influences our lake. I think we should have some representation there as far as liaison assignment to that. We keep saying it's one of our greatest assets, and then we really aren't a part of a main body that helps support and drive what occurs out there. So I just think that would be prudent on our part to have some type of involvement via a liaison individual. It's my 2 cents.
Okay. We're almost done, because once we're done with this title, we're done. So keep a little pep in our step here. So chapter 7.21 was about the 911, and that also was just, we'll probably be putting it into a different chapter or title. And then, again, the punishment provisions would be, for this entire title, would be put in Title 22. Like I said, I did skip over council procedures, in part because the full draft of Title VII that I had did not incorporate the revisions that you guys had adopted earlier this year. And also in part is I think we've already kind of made enough changes to that one. I think it's good. Any other questions or anything? I think, stay tuned for the next work session, which will be airport and, I had it. Title V. Was that floodplain? Yeah.
Building codes and floodplain.
Yep. So,
Fasten your seatbelts.
any other questions for me, council, or comments? Or again, I just want to reiterate and thank staff because they really did provide feedback and it was good. Makes my job a lot easier than hunting people down trying to see what's going on in their heads. So,
Council, anything? Anything to come before the body? Councilman Tupper.
Just thanks to the staff for working hard on this. I know it's something that needs to be done. I think it probably, by state law, we have to do it every 10 years. Am I correct? Or
You're allowed to do it every 10 years.
Okay.
It's not a requirement.
okay, so are you allowed to do it more often?
The whole recodification, no.
Okay.
So the difference is that you're doing it all at once. Now, you can make amendments to your ordinances individually anytime you deem necessary, but this is a first reading is every single change in the ordinance. Second reading, you're approving every change all at once.
Okay. Thank you for everybody that's put in all the hard work.
Just judging by a few references that I've seen tonight and previously in this process, I think it might have been several decades since anyone has opened up our ordinances for review.
Has anybody read, can you still park your horse downtown? I don't know. I thought you. You know?
All right, hold your horses, council. So. Any future council items read ahead? Here, none. Public comment, if anyone is here who would like to discuss something in front of the council that is not on today's agenda, now's your time to do so. There's no reason to go into executive session, therefore the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion made by Councilman Tupper, seconded by Councilman Peters. Any discussion on that? Hearing none, the motion is to adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries.